told you. Oh, hello. Hello and welcome to the Silver Sentinels. This is going to be part 4 of roughly a 12-part miniseries. There's going to be a lot of extra stuff involved too. And we're talking about 10 million square miles. That's a lot of world building. And crazy as crazy does. We're going to talk about, what are we going to talk about? Let's see here. We're going to talk about nomenclature, statistics, demographics. We're talking about stuff only the nerdiest of nerds is going to care about. And I think that's you. We're going to talk about history, archaeology. We're going to get into some cosmology. You might as well throw in zoology and a touch of physics. We're still only scratching the surface. In case you didn't know, my name is Lewis Nichols. I've done some stuff. I was a nerd way before being a nerd was cool. I know you've heard it before. I've published some short stories. I've got an RPG out there. It wasn't that great, but it's there. It was the effort that counted. It was a long time ago. It's all steps. If you're trying to do something big, small steps will get you there. What else have I done? I don't know, some stuff. What does my list say? Oh yeah, I'm humble. It says it right here. The most important thing is that I don't claim to know everything about everything. But when it comes to world building, I'm your guy.
Creepy bastard.
You remember Pram? The last time we talked about the wilds of the north, and before that, the states of the east. Now we're moving south, sliding a little west, and gazing seaward. There's a lot of islands down there, and we're going to talk about them. This is the Bay of Castilia, and the archipelago cleverly named the Pramatolites. This area, Greater Castilia, about half of the continent's population lives in this region. Castilia is so prominent on Pram, foreigners often come to believe the whole continent is named Castilia. The term Greater Castilia might refer to just the southwest quadrant, or it could be the whole continent. It will almost always include the archipelago, and for the very bold or ignorant, it might even be including the Hebrides, which we will discuss in part 5. Believe it or not, I'm not just trying to confuse things for the sake of it. Regions are known by different names depending upon your perspective. Ever heard of Catalonia? By show of hands, I see about half of you. It's part of Spain, but if you ask your average resident, he's not claiming to be Spanish. There's a good chance he'll tell you he's Catalonian. The identity is so strong, there's a pretty good chance it'll be its own country someday, independent of Spain entirely. People groups don't always identify how you think they should just by looking at a world map. Fun fact number 2. The Castilia region and the Pramatolites are very similar culturally. I originally thought about treating them as their own individual regions, but that would have been a huge mistake. Once I decided to put them together, the region started to make sense from a world building point of view. We're going to talk about a lot of stuff today, but we're going to focus on culture. First, we're going to start with some simple geography. The region is partitioned by the Goshen Mountains here, the Surman Mountains here, and a whole bunch of oceans everywhere else. The Durantolite Islands are north of the far western peninsula, which happens to be called the Durrania Peninsula. It's occupied by Bake and Shabinazad. The Durantolites are lightly colonized by both states, but largely wilderness. You'll also notice a great deal of the interior is unoccupied. This hill country is effectively pacified, but still essentially wilderness. A perfect place for a fledgling fighting group's first excursion. 3 states occupy the eastern corner of our subject region: the Republic of Huma, the Persephus Confederation, and Oja. Finally, the headwaters of the Fegat are largely autonomous, but still considered to be part of the biggest dog at the bowl. This is Castilia. That's right, it's not just a place, it's a political state. It controls huge chunks of the mainland and almost all the islands way down to the southern tips of the Pramatolites. It is the superpower of Pram and one of the strongest states on Pelakar. Government-wise, Castilia is an oligarchy. It is controlled by the Merku Trade Federation and a dozen or so rich families. Bake is something of a democracy, and Shabinazad a simple autocracy. Oja has one of the strongest monarchies in the region, and the Upper Fegat is essentially unorganized communities with shifting allegiances to a handful of local warlords. I always say that money can be as complicated as you want to make it. We've super simplified things in the real world. We have debit or Visa, both tied to bank accounts. You get paid with direct deposit. If somebody happens to give you a check, you can process it right through your phone. In a fantasy setting, you generally don't have that kind of stuff. Now, games generally simplify things down to coins made of precious metal and just leave it at that. I'm not saying it's wrong, it sure is easy. But there is an opportunity for world building, drama, adventure, and a little confusion. Oh, some skill development too, and character building. The Merku Trade Confederacy has convinced most of the region to trade in the Castilian Fisher. This silver coin is minted by several of the local states and guaranteed, not as silver, but as the value of 10 coins for a basket of salted sea carp. Yes, a basket is an official measure. Further, the Surman gold piece is set at a yearly adjustable rate at between 8 and 12 fishers. Despite these, possibly because of these supposedly guaranteed rates, illegally shaved Surmans are common and not well regulated. Half gold is a common term referring to a gold coin chopped in half. Adding to the clutter, most governments mint copper pennies, as silver and gold is beyond the grasp of the poor. These have no fixed rate, but are 20 to 1 to a fisher as a rule. Barter for goods and services is common. Bits of coral, drilled and hung on strings, is perhaps the king of unofficial trade units. A single bit is roughly a penny, a long strand worth several gold pieces, perhaps even more if being traded to someone traveling from a land where bright red coral is less common. If I were running this part of the world in a campaign, I would post all my prices in silver pieces, gold if I'm running it in Dungeons and Dragons. Then I'd give a 15% discount to any character with a barter-related skill. Let the players know what's actually happening, but nobody wants to do hard math and check exchange rates just to buy some basic supplies. So why concoct this mess at all? Well, some players will eat it up, even using it as a role-playing prop. It also creates a whole realm for economic-based storylines and might add to role-playing opportunities as you introduce merchants and merchant-adjacent characters to the region. If your characters are new to the area, it lets you enhance the stranger in a foreign land aspect of the game. Alrighty then, what are the coolest things on this map? Number 1, the Fegat Headwaters. If you're into river rides, this is the place for you. Before coming out onto the flatland, the Fegat runs for 20 miles through the Goshan Mountains. It would be a rough ride, but somebody with the right skills can make it in a canoe. More spectacular than the ride is the view. In many places, sheer rock rises right along the shoreline to tower over anyone floating along. Destination number 2, Ajek Alami, the whole of the world. Sometime in the distant past, someone was apparently trying to find the other side of the planet. At ground level, the pit is nearly 100 feet across. By the time it descends to its final depth of 300 feet, it's down to a mere 20-foot diameter. A ramp, then steps, have been carved into the side, steadily corkscrewing down to the bottom. Cut marks are clear, and the hole appears to have been created by rather conventional means. There are occasional discussions about starting up the dig, just in case the originators were really on to something. Next up, the Ija Prominent. This granite spire is at the end of a natural jetty stretching 500 feet out into the sea. The spire is flat at the top, where a fire pit is maintained to warn off shipping from the navigational hazard. In 2066, or the 22nd year of the whale, bright glowing gems were donated by military officers returning from their observations of the Keld invasion. These stones have yet to burn out, and now light the Prominent. At number 4 on my list, the Firestone thermal vents. The geologically active swath of land is full of steam vents and hot springs. It's not as barren as you might think, with hardy trees and shrubs growing where they can. All of these species are adapted to survive in the harsh conditions, But hey, you didn't come here to talk about the plants. The hilly terrain is remarkable for colorful low ridges and mineral pools. They are a destination for spiritualists and those seeking the healing properties of those warm, bubbling pools. And finally, the Pillars of Hussein. The Republic of Huma is a pretty green place, known for wide open fields and copious herds roaming their vastness. However, just 2 miles north of the city of Huma is a 100-acre rise of stony ground covered with unexplained pillars. Officially, there are 784 of these stone formations, and they are not all created equal. The Pillar of Ain is 70 feet tall, the largest in the field. Scholars argue. Yeah, that's it. Just scholars argue. They could be natural, but not likely. Some say it was a race of giants who built them. Others say it was the work of some long forgotten god. No matter the reason, it's a pretty cool place to visit. Beginning around 200 years ago, the Merku tribes began to consolidate the Castilian peninsula. At the time, these peoples were starkly divided along ethnic lines. The Monkey, humans, and Iquirda of the mid-peninsula were always in danger from the many threats of the region. Foremost among these was the warlike Osmolds. This parasitic species constituted an intelligent, zombie-like race controlled by its central vegetative mass. In the modern world, Pellicar modern world with magic and stuff, not like machine guns. Anyway, they were very little threat, as a number of magical and pseudo-magical agents can put a quick end to these infections. However, in the Dark Ages, they very nearly took the lands for themselves. When the Merku eventually ended the threat and burned out the central pod, they licked their wounds, but they strengthened their union. Above all, the conflict left them with one haunting lesson learned. What you do not control might one day come to control you. As Rome did in the ancient days of Italy, the unified Merku tribes found themselves in successive wars despite relative geographic isolation. They won most of these wars, bringing in foreign populations and expanding their power. 150 years ago, the Altriti Hinduwasi, a confederacy mainly of elves, waged desperate war against the Merku, but even they eventually fell. The Merku did not destroy them, but instead absorbed the elven tribes. Preemptive wars of aggression were fought against tribes of Minotaur, orcs, and dwarves. Then, barely 40 years ago, the free peoples of southwestern Pram made an alliance of their own. Finally, at the Battle of the Tall Grass, the Merku faced off against the combined powers of central Castilia, and they lost. But those central powers could not win the peace. The alliance failed, with individual tribes and states returning to their own lands. The Merku nobility that survived made fleeting attempts to rebuild, but instead became a people without a home. Stronger individuals from the wandering tribes drifted into mercenary work, eventually taking control of many of the region's trade routes. In less than 30 years, they found the victory their predecessors could not. As prospering merchants, they control Castilia, all the trade routes in southwest Pram, and most of them throughout the entire northern half of the Silver Sentinels. They have their fingers in the business of nearly every state and keep the region's nobility on leashes with the lure of wealth and perceived power. It's time to talk about demographics and ethnicity. Humans and orcs are the two major races, but between them barely constitute over 30% of the population. Past that, you've got Rispy, Elves, Monkey, Iquirda, Ranayan, Tagara, Dwarves, and Minotaur. Every one of those I just listed is around the 10% mark. After that, you've got Mamluks, Gnomes, and the ever-present Other. As you can see, no species here has a majority. It's not one of those fantasy worlds with human cities, elven forests, and some dwarves living in caves. Instead, our urban zones are a mismatched melting pot. Large communities, cities, or tight collections of towns connected by easy routes can support all this diversity. The first thing an ethnic group needs for long-term stability is a big enough pool of potential partners within reasonable travel times. At 500, you're fine. Less than that, things get shaky. Less than 50, you've got problems. The internet taught me that. It's the 550 rule. It can't be wrong. Of course, there's a lot at play here. Reasonable travel times are affected by geography, economics, and possibly the laws of the land. There are several cities here with populations of 50,000 or more on Pram, into the hundreds of thousands if you include surrounding communities. That's more than enough to make a happy home for all this vibrant variety. The next real question is, how are they going to all get along? Minotaur are one of the species that can easily get excluded. Wide horns are a challenge in a city built for other species. Doorways and even hallways can be an annoyance. A quick turn of the head can be painful, especially when you remember Pelicar's Minotaur are not really all that tall. What about the Equirta and Centaurs too? They tend to be pretty big, even if you're not going too crazy tall. They don't use beds or chairs or the bathrooms made for most other species. Now, for many races, their unique qualities actually turn out to be an advantage. Dwarves and gnomes love basement apartments that might otherwise be undesirable. Strong climbers are much more fitted for 5th and 6th stories. They might even scale the side of the building rather than bothering with busy internal stairwells. I think variable floor designs would have to be pretty normal on a fantasy world. Your first floor might very well be accommodating as possible for the beefy boys. It might be almost barn-like to take care of Equirta, Centaur, and what other large Velito might want to rent a room. Your common area gets moved to the second floor, possibly along with offices and shopping. It could be where the bars are, or the tavern. If the structure is some sort of inn or an apartment block, some of your upper floors will be squat for your many shorter species, but most will probably stick to the 8-foot ceilings. Finally, the top may be built for those special cases of flyers and climbers. Alright, this is supposed to be strictly about Southwest Pram. We're getting a little off topic. Let's try to be more specific. I can't talk about all the ethnic groups in one video, so we're just going to have to do the best we can and save the rest for later. Sentinel humans. Skin pigmentation varies across the continental zone, but most human ethnic groups are still distinct. They are shorter than the human norm of 5'9", but not by much. The real tell is the abundance of straight black hair and strong foreheads. Swinging back to skin color again, the humans of Pram tend to be a lighter shade of brown. The Dusker Shang Orc. Have you ever noticed how orcs just aren't good looking? Sorry guys, I guess it's just one of those facts of fantasy. However, they do gain bonuses in all the physical attributes, and that makes them very desirable, or at least tough enough to fight back against persecution. They are still considerably more segregated than most Velito. I've given them some odd habits that I'd rather not discuss on YouTube. More like YouTube would rather me not discuss on their platform. Moving right along. Generally, speaking of orcs, they can be somewhat bestial in appearance depending upon their lineage. Perhaps due to the prevalence of reptiles in the region, Duskershang orcs have a somewhat lizard-like appearance. They are prone to scaly skin and sometimes have vestigial tails. Lambersil elves. Long ago, these elves originated on Rothius. In the Last Age, they spread throughout the Sentinels. They are known for their copper-brown skin, a strange hue even for elves. They are usually paler. Lambricils not only have the brown skin, but the same shade of hair, and their eyes are only a little bit lighter. Those who acknowledge more than 7 colors might call it a peanut brown. The ethnic group can also be recognized for their unusually long fingers. They are noticeably longer, relative to their hand size, than just about anyone else's. Elves are among the most likely Velito to isolate themselves from the rest of society, but that's not the case on Pram. Lambersil elves are well mixed throughout the cities and villages of the land. You may have heard that I use the word lizard man to refer to just about anything humanoid and remotely lizard-like. I've called Ranayan lizard men. They're more like salamanders. I call little scrubby first-level monsters that, look like lizards, lizard men. I also call full-blown, grown-up Velito that can gain levels like anybody else, lizard men. However, those lizard men have individual names. These guys are the Mamleks. They are highly agile. They are long-tailed. I'd say they look a lot like a western alligator lizard, even though perchance AI doesn't seem to understand what that is. They lay eggs and mix well with other social species. They're average in all attributes except for reflexes, where they get a +3 bonus. Better go with +2 if you're importing them to D&D. They breed well and are competitive as a playable species. Finally, they are in that 5 to 6 foot range where they can interchange armor with a lot of other common species without too much trouble. Castilian Mamleks are prone to yellow eyes, tan faces, and linear black scale patterns on the rest of their bodies. Similar to most of the reptile species, they aren't picky about what they eat and don't mind live food. However, the Castilians tend to be sensitive about who might be watching. Many of the region's premier citizens are members of this race and bend to the pressure of common practices. Merku equirta. Just so you know, equirta in general are a centaur-like species modeled on deer rather than horses. They still tend to be rather tall, and they are very quick and sure-footed. Merku equirta have an even taller than usual upper body, but they are most notable for their delicate horn structure. Merku humans. These guys and gals can be identified by their distinctive chins. They tend to be a little thinner and taller than most of the humans in the zone. This does give them a lanky appearance, but they are just as capable as their fellows. They tend to have darker skin, and culturally they will still grow their hair out long and keep their faces clean. Merku monkey. These simians are nearly hairless and built like dwarves. Well, not exactly like dwarves, more like dwarves with longer arms and a tail. Yeah, that's it. They are brown-skinned and dark-eyed. Compared to other monkey, they climb a little bit worse, but they are born slightly more hardy. They also suffer a beauty penalty when dealing with pretty much all other species. Rispy. The Rispy are a winged, furred species. If you're equating them to something relatable, think about humanoid bats, or better yet, poorly anthropomorphized flying squirrels. They are considered inferior in almost every culture, including their homelands, and they are not among the most spectacular of Velito. Rispy cannot fly, and take penalties in strength and stamina. For what it's worth, they do have weak heat-sensitive vision. Most of the Velito find them unattractive, giving them an interspecies penalty for beauty. They are not particularly strong breeders. They are not a race PCs will ever play, and few will be notable NPCs, but they are a solid third-tier levelable species to add some variety to the world. On Pram, they are unfortunately a slave race, taken advantage of to do hard labor and menial tasks for the elites of society. They are brown-furred with dark eyes and small hands. Their wings and arms are one, meaning they don't have the ever-elusive ability to fire a bow and fly at the same time. Rushtaman Minotaur. These Minotaur are among the beastmen and women of Pelikar's Minotaur. They are black-furred and shaggy, taller than most others by 2 inches, bringing them on par with humans. Their horns are heavy and curved, more like the horns of a Nubian ibex than a cow. If you're going to import them into your world, I suggest giving them an extra point of strength and probably taking away another point of reflexes, just to make things fair. That's all we have for the Velito today. No more ethnicity. We got other things to talk about. But don't worry, in future episodes, we're going to talk about dwarves, gnomes, Ranayan, Tagara, and all the rest. Okay, hold on. I just looked at the word count. I don't know if this is going to get all that deep. So let's just talk about music, marriage customs, some rituals, and we'll finish up with that whole sacred north thing. I really was liking the idea of leaning hard into the whole culture thing here. Probably means you're going to get another bonus episode, which we're looking at quite a few before the next major episode anyway. And now, let's talk about music. Greater Castilia is the dominant culture of the continental zone. Their style of economy, their ethnic groups, and the roots of their religion all have influences throughout the civilized lands of the Silver Sentinels. Music is just one more way the region is winning the culture wars. The focus of Castilian music at this time in history is the chobe, a percussion instrument that is little more than a hollowed-out log. Usually, the chobe is about 4 feet long and 8 inches in diameter. The most usual way to play the instrument is to sit, placing one end on the ground and the other end over the shoulder. This leaves an exposed surface to beat with heavy sticks, producing a high-pitched knock. There are larger versions and smaller. Some are only a foot in length and play by banging two of them together. Others are large enough they have to be set on a stand and are played standing up. They all tend to crack more than thump and can also be used to create a rasping sound. The chobe and other Castilian drums might be accompanied by wind or string. While instrumentals are valued, music will usually be accompanied by voice. Recently, female singers have come into style, but there are many males still in the business. Songs are usually under 5 minutes and played in themed sets. The current fashion is for whimsical lyrics with little meaning. A few years ago, songs were more serious, even used to convey the news. Some of those are still popular, especially among older listeners looking for that nostalgic high. Stringed instruments include the wobble, similar to a two-stringed fiddle, the baron, a handheld harp, and the discertain, essentially a banjo. All these instruments make up what can be considered traditional arrangements. New are the wind instruments carried by the Celts. These have only had a few years to begin monocirculation, and they are very much a novelty. Most of them can be equated to whistles and pipes. Dancing often accompanies this type of performance, usually by those listening. Several structured dances exist and are common. Beyond a little toe tapping and swaying, unstructured dance is considered bad manners. The most common dances are very similar to the waltz and footwork, but with more hip movement involved. Note that there are several other musical traditions alive and well in the region. These include booting, very similar to square dancing, but more aggressive, high court, the telling of epics accompanied by string and drum, and late Russ, where large percussion bands play for crowds in the thousands, all dancing to a very specific choreography. The civilized people of the Sentinels tend to be a one guy, one gal sort of bunch. They also tend to segregate their households by species, considering the mixing of humanoids a sin. A typical wealthy house might be a Mr. and a Mrs. Minotaur and their 5 children. The butler, the maid, the nanny, and the carriage driver are all going to be Minotaur as well. Businesses tend to be uniform, including the crews of ships. The exception here are slaves, which are rarely the species of the house members. Within these strictures, exclusionary racism is actually pretty rare. Human butchers buy from dwarven ranchers and treat their clients equally, regardless of hair, horns, or the number of feet. Urban areas are diverse in the makeup of species. Guilds might encompass many races, and leadership is usually not determined by race. Local governments are much the same, with appointees usually chosen for reasons other than their background. Instead, other things, probably equally unfair, are used to determine such appointments, like the status of their house or prowess in battle, possibly even their ability to do a good job. Now, I'm not saying there isn't some casual racism going on here. There are many a poem about young interspecies love, and most of them end poorly. It's a taboo of the culture that has been well ingrained for generations. It harkens back to the depths of the deep dark age. They were desperate times, and unfortunately, when the going gets tough, the tough often divide themselves into teams. All that said, the peoples of the Durrani Peninsula are some of the least committed to old habits. Call it a counterculture. While official marriage is pretty much out of the question, unofficial arrangements are somewhat common and only slightly scandalous. Barriers had been breaking down for a generation, but it was the High Lord of Shabenazad who took a solid swing at shattering the prohibition. It's been just a few years ago that the high-ranking Minotaur bachelor was caught with a human girlfriend. Even in the lower classes, arranged marriages are fairly common. Given that local pockets of some species are rather small, it's almost a necessity. Families with marriageable daughters will often attend festival events in larger population centers with the sole intent of finding a potential groom. Normally, parents meet and agree to correspond, eventually sending the daughter off to be wed. The opposite is possible as well. In perhaps 20% of cases, the female is the clear dominant in the proposed marriage. Note, there are lots of exceptions to this practice. It's far less common in larger populations, and some regions have a far different dynamic. For instance, local festivals on the Faggot are usually ended with mass wedding ceremonies and daughters and sons left to make a new home with the families they have just met. Rituals. Rituals don't have to be elaborate public gatherings. It can be something simple, small, and personal, like saying a prayer before bed. My mother used to keep a diary. That was her ritual. Maybe it's something practical, like patting down your pockets before you leave for the day or close the car door. Really, though, we're talking about something bigger. The first thing that pops into my mind for North America is sports. Lots of families have at least one kid involved in baseball or some other game. Participation takes up a pretty significant portion of their lives between practice and the games themselves. It might determine where you live to make sure you get into the right high school with a prolific team. College sports are $1 billion industry. I mean, really, how many adults do you know that have made sports a part of their lives? Maybe you play in an amateur league or a fantasy league. Maybe you just go to the games. Hell's season tickets to Major League Baseball makes your love of the sport a full-time job. How many sports adages do you know? Have you ever been to third base on a first date? Have you ever been put down for the count? Have you ever gotten so overwhelmed with a work project you had to drop back and punt? Or did you go for the Hail Mary? These rituals are so much a part of everyday life, the economy shows it. We don't make athletes millionaires because it's the smart thing to do. I mean, we could have probably put all that money into research for cancer and had it beaten a long time ago. Did you know that in many U.S. states, the highest paid government employee is the college football coach? In Greater Castilia, it's sailing. Most families, all but the poorest, own a boat. For most, this is the Ashian sail. The Ashian is pretty much an outrigger canoe built for no more than 5 human-sized occupants. Apartment blocks can have dozens of these stacked against their building. If you're going to visit your friends on the next street and you don't see a boat in their front yard, don't bother knocking. They've gone sailing. Color and flair add to the prestige of ownership, with bright reds and yellows being the most popular. Just like sports-related adages in the U.S., sailing quips are usual parts of speech in Castilia. I'm not dirty, Mama. It's just a few grains of sand in the ocean. I think I'm in love. She dances like the waves coming to shore. The tides come and they go. Tomorrow will be better. Alone I am nothing, but like the drops of water from the ocean, together we are Castilia. We have briefly... Okay, settle down. We have mentioned a strong belief among some residents of Pram that the northern lands are sacred. Many of the great living beasts there are considered gods, and even if they are not, it's easy to see them as holy. Even without the kaiju, these pristine lands could still be treasured as a realm of spirituality, not a resource to be desecrated. But spirituality isn't for everybody. There are a good many Pramalites who either don't care or heartily advocate for exploitation. For now, they don't have much power. If anything, the Holy Land argument is only growing stronger. As beast cults evolve into organized churches and religion, spellcasting priests become a factor that is a strong voice in determining policy. However, the value of the land and resources only become greater day by day. Lumber is in short supply, and the need for new ships is more pressing than ever. The first battlefield in this conflict was the island chain known as the Durantalites, and we can declare a winner. 20 years ago, as the belief systems were being codified, they were included as protected territories. Both Bake and Shabenazad disputed these claims and took action. Both stated there was no reason to draw the line there, and other states were merely blocking their natural expansion. Both planted a number of small colonies. They stated that they were not actively doing so, just that a number of citizens took it upon themselves. In diplomatic circles, they promised to remove the colonies, but until they could, the only way to ensure the safety of their citizens was to bolster the colonies. Political games and blatant lies continued for years, the colonies growing all the time. As word came of a foreign invasion in the south, all eyes turned that direction. The population of the islands quietly doubled as demands for wood swelled. For all intents, this issue is completely settled. These islands have been populated. It is done. Dead center of the continent, the Vasek Hills are another hotly contested region. Both Oja and the Persephus Federation have made arguments for expanding. However, opposition is strong here, making it difficult to simply slip into the region and establish colonies. The Rangers actively patrol and are not afraid to use violence to hold the line. There were no Rangers when the Durantalites were settled, but the faction still takes it as a personal affront. They have vowed never to let history repeat itself. Further in their favor, the parent federation, the Ascendian Order, is well entrenched in the Republic of Huma. It makes it easy to support their brothers in the wilderness. Finally, we have the Shimshal. It's a giant lake. It's right here. One could argue this is merely an extension of the Vasek Hills dilemma, as the two border each other. One could also argue the problem is a mirror of that at Dry Castle Lake in the east. However, the nature of the threat has its own political nuances. Here, the Persephus Federation is boldly proclaiming that the entire shoreline of the lake is part of their rightful domain. So far, their attempts at colonization have been stopped, twice by the Rangers, and a third time by a freak storm on the lake. Federation Counterculture. I have a lot of plans for talking about culture, but when this airs, I doubt that I've really gotten around to it. I think an important thing about world building the traits of a region is to realize that everybody will never be on board. For every aspect of culture, there is a counterculture. If your people group is super into law and order, there will be individuals who idealize outlaws. If the mood of the city encourages free love, there will be a chastity movement. The Persephus Federation is the counterculture of Greater Castilia. They have religion, but have largely rejected the beast cults. They control lucrative iron and adamantine. Oh, nope, wrong game. Volcanic iron reserves. They have invested heavily in Ziblich, fostering an apprenticeship system and to further develop the art. They may eventually be squashed as the odd man out, or perhaps they'll flourish. It's hard to say what lies in their future. Is it a war against the Rangers? A greater war against their neighboring nations? Or will Pram stand by as they spread out along the Shimshal's shores? Well, I guess 5,000 word scripts are just normal now. Setting expectations. I do not expect the rest of the parts to this series to be so expansive. Pram is big, it's populated, and it's diverse. We're introducing a whole lot of new concepts that are going to apply to the entire region of the Silver Sentinels. In a way, I feel like this is already the halfway point of the series, but I could be wrong. Concerning Pram, we still have to get deep into the actual nuts and bolts of the religion, and I have several other bonus episodes planned. You're probably going to get one or two of those before our next major episode, but we are writing this long before that is all written. This first one on paper, back on May 7th. Now I'm recording it in November. The leaves aren't even on the trees yet. Well, that was when I wrote it. Now they've come on and they've all fallen off again. No matter what time of year you're listening, I want to thank you all for visiting the channel. I hope I've earned your subscription. If you like what you hear, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel and makes me feel better. Ultimately, you don't have to do any of that. I love you all, and I want you to know that you are important. You have a place in this world, and it would be a sadder place without you. I hope you all have a perfect rest of the day. You deserve it. Cheers.